Hello, I'm Martin Travis. I'm in the home of Homer Sarasohn in Scottsdale, Arizona. I want you to meet Homer. Tell me, what were you doing just prior to your going to Japan? What sort of job did you have? What were you doing during World War II, really?
During part of the war, I was in the paratroops. And long about Christmas of 1943, I was given a medical discharge. I wasn't such a very good paratrooper. And from there, I went to radiation lab in MIT.
Mm-hmm.
And was there.
That's where they were developing radar, mostly.
My job was to develop search radar, and as a matter of fact, one of my major projects at that time was Cadillac. Cadillac was the first installation of search radar on an airplane. And I knew nothing about airplanes. I did know something about radar. And it was a fascinating experience to...
Now, at that era, not very many people knew about radar. How is it that you knew? Where did you go to school?
Well, I had gone to... my undergraduate work was at Wayne University in Detroit. And then...
In what? In physics?
In physics.
In physics.
Now, I had the idea that I would like to become a nuclear physicist. At that time, we didn't know anything about the atomic bomb, but I was working on atomic stabilization, atomic dispersion. And, but then this was during the depths of the Depression, and there wasn't very much money available for research, especially in physics. And so I got into radio engineering. And for a good number of years, I worked on developing high-powered transmitters, antenna systems, and international broadcast. And it was from there that I went into the Army. It was from the Army that I went over to the radiation lab and applied my background in radio to radar. As a matter of fact, one of my...
radar at Grand Lab, your knowledge of radio and worked on Cadillac. It just an incident. I helped install Cadillac in an airplane because I was at Wright Field. But go ahead.
I didn't get to Wright Field until later. But as a matter of fact, as I think of it, one of my first jobs in radar was to do research in modulation. And when I think back upon it now, I wonder at how primitive we were. And because the radar modulator that I devised worked on a spark gap principle, a rotating spark gap. But anyway, we went on and became much more sophisticated to the point where we had an installation of a radar search system on an SMV, a Navy airplane that had been assigned to us. And one of the remarkable things, as I recall, was, as I say, I knew something about electronics. I knew nothing about aircraft. And I didn't dare put a system into an airplane and then ask the airplane to go off. So we did some taxi experiments. And that poor little SMB went wobbling down the runway like a little guppy. We learned more after that. But after the radiation lab closed, I went to work for Raytheon in their research laboratory. And my project there was was, again, to apply what we had learned in radar to civilian use. And my project there was a transcontinental microwave relay system. And the first installation that we had ran from Waltham down to New York City. And it was while I was there that I received a call one day from a colonel in Washington. Said that he was relaying the message from General MacArthur that I was wanted to work in MacArthur's headquarters in Japan.
Why you?
Well, I didn't take it seriously because I didn't know this colonel, and I had no way of thinking that he knew who I was. And as you know, from your own knowledge of radiation lab at that time, we were surrounded by a bunch of jokers. And so I took it as a joke that somebody was pretending. I had no idea that this was serious. And so I never returned the call. About 2 weeks later, I had another telephone call from a very indignant person. I might at least have had the courtesy to return the call. I said, "Oh, you were serious?" I agreed to go down to Washington to find out what this was about.
When was this about? 46?
This was at the very end of 45 or
Beginning of
46. Well, the gist of it was that I agreed to go over my project at Raytheon was pretty well established. As a matter of fact, we'd even made a commercial use of
The system was in and out, right?
Right. And so I agreed to go over for about 9 months. I wound up staying more than 4 years. And
What did you find when you got there?
it was a very difficult situation for 2 reasons. One was I still remembered the Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And
Baton. And all those things.
exactly. The Death March in Baton, the Japanese treatment, particularly of paratroops, the Japanese treatment of the Allied prisoners of war, most barbarous, most horrible. And these were the enemy. As a matter of fact, when I first walked down the streets in Tokyo, I would set a course straight ahead. And regardless of these little people in front of me, I would just plow through. They were the enemy. Somewhere along the way, I woke up and realized how stupid I was being. Because I was there to do a job that had been assigned to me. Taking this attitude certainly was not creative or productive.
Was there something that triggered the change with you?
Yes. I began, I'll come to it perhaps a little bit later, but I began to learn the language.
Were you married?
Yes.
Did you take your wife along?
Not at that time. Wives depended.
Take your wife along at the beginning.
No.
But what made you started to learn the language, and then what else?
I started to go to classes, and I found that was not satisfactory. So I got books and started to learn the language myself. But then
Not easy.
Japanese is not easy. But then also what helped was that I was spending more time living, actually, with the Japanese than with the Americans. So that
I don't understand. You lived with a Japanese family or something?
No. I lived in Army-provided lodging. As a matter of fact, the billet we were in was called the Daiichi Hotel. But my work took me around to Japanese. And another thing that happened was that I started out using interpreters. These interpreters were Nisei, GIs, and many of them were from Hawaii. But the Japanese, even though they recognized that they were Nisei, they were not acceptable to the Japanese because they had left Japan, they had left the family, so to speak. That was one aspect. Another aspect was that the GIs were Americanized, and their Japanese was not colloquial. So that they, as interpreters, had difficulty. I found it easier to learn the language so that I could get directly in touch with the Japanese.
What was your job? What was your assignment?
Well, let me go, you said, what did I find when I first went there? And let me go back to that. I mentioned that my first impression was that these were the enemy. And I realized that this was not a very intelligent point of view to have if I was going to try to do any work there. So I got over that. The other thing that I found was that the land was absolutely devastated. The distance between Yokohama and Tokyo, a distance of about 35 miles. During the war, this was the prime industrial site for Japan. Major industries were located in this 35-mile distance. The American bombers were absolutely efficient and effective and devastating in their laying this entire area to waste. It was almost as flat as this table. This is what we found. There was almost nothing to work with. The Japanese people were devastated. As a matter of fact, they had very little shelter. They had very little to wear. They had very little to eat. There was an expression in Japanese that translated says that these people were so desperate they would even have asked their house cats for help if they could have gotten it. There was no industry. There were no factories standing. So that, to answer your question, what did I find when I arrived? I found a land that was laying to waste. Completely. And so, literally, and I think this is important for trying to understand where we stand now vis-a-vis the Japanese and where American industry stands vis-a-vis Japanese industry, that literally the Japanese started from scratch in 1945, 1946. The situation is sometimes compared with Germany after the war. The question is frequently asked, how come the Japanese did so well and the Germans were
much slower?
Yeah. The difference is that of the two countries, Japan started at a lower basis after the war. Germany could recover a fair amount and did not have to go through all the trauma that the Japanese did. Anyway, this is what I found. Now you say, what was my job? My job was to reestablish and rehabilitate the communications industry.
But just a question. How did they decide that you were the guy to do this? You had not been an industrialist who had built enterprises. You worked at MIT. You were primarily a research and development person.
Well, that's right. The unique thing, I think, for the Americans at the time of the Second World War was that we were industrious, we were creative, we were daring, we were innovative, and the people all together, Radiation Lab, for example. People I worked with were at the Radiation Lab, and again, I'm sure you will remember. One of the people I worked with was a graduate mortician. Another one was an English teacher. Another one was an engineer, but an engineer by title rather than by experience. But these people came together in a most unique and possibly once-in-a-lifetime kind of way. And they were caught up in the enthusiasm of what Radiation Lab at MIT stood for.
Well, are you telling me this guy with a degree as a mortician could start working intelligently with waveguides?
No, but he was smart enough and dedicated enough that he would take direction. And the job that he was assigned, he did it very well. But all of this was part of the Office of Scientific Research and Development
yes.
that Vannevar Bush.
Yeah, Vannevar Bush put together.
And this was, I think, this was a creative spirit. I think it was unique.
So you went there with that background and can-do kind of spirit.
That's right. And then also, what was typical of our activity at that time was, although we were engaged in research, the research was aimed very specifically to product development. And we created prototypes, system prototypes. And we would go to a manufacturer like GE, for example, or Raytheon. Raytheon was one of the closest manufacturers. We did a lot of business with Raytheon. We did business with Crosley out in Cincinnati. We did business all over. But what would happen is we would call these people from Crosley, from Raytheon, from all over. Yeah, they would work with us for a while. We would hand them a prototype. And we would say, here, build 100 or build 1,000 exactly like this.
And you nurse them through that.
That's right.
So that's how you got this hands-on kind of manufacturing experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so now with that background, you're walking the streets of Tokyo, or looking at the devastation.
Look at the devastation and say, good God, how do we do
Where
this?
do you start?
Because our charge was, from MacArthur, these people, the Japanese, will not be a burden upon the United States. As a matter of fact, the order came down from Truman. There was some controversy at the time in the American government. Morgenthau at that time, one of the secretaries in the cabinet, said that we will have to occupy Japan for 20 generations. This country was devastated, it had nothing, there were no raw materials, there were no possibilities, factories were gone, and so on. It will take 20 generations for them to recover. Truman said, no, we will not permit the Japanese to be a burden upon the American economy. The order went out from him to MacArthur to revive the Japanese economy as quickly as possible. The order came down to me in the civil communications section, two things. One was, let's get in touch with the enemy. There were no communication systems, domestic communication systems. The newspapers by that time were just beginning to be printed and distributed. The Japanese did not know what to expect from the Americans. This was the enemy. We on our side, the Americans on our side, did not get in touch with the Japanese. They were our hated enemy. They were the ones who did Pearl Harbor. They were the ones who did the Bataan Death March. They were to be hated. The Japanese did not know the American mentality. We certainly did not know the Japanese. We did not know their language. We did not know their customs. They were, excuse me for using the expression, but the common appellation that was given them, they were the damn goods at that time. So here were two bodies not in touch. The order was to create something new and different, and so you had to get in touch. So the order came down to set up a information and education program, and indeed one of the sections, I mentioned the various sections that made up the SCAP organization. One of the sections in SCAP was the Civil Information and Education section, and their charge was indeed, if you please, to propagandize or to educate or to inform the Japanese populace that the Americans did not mean to
stay.
Well, not only to stay, but they did not mean to terrorize the Japanese. I think the Americans generally do not engage in insidious propaganda, but we did mean to create a receptive stance in the local population. One way, and the only way, that was available at that time was through radio broadcasting. So the idea was to get radio receivers into the hands of the people as quickly as possible. We could use Army transmitters to broadcast radio signals, but we could not import domestic radio receivers from the United States. So the order was to create, build, rebuild, reestablish a radio receiver manufacturing capability in the country. The other aspect of it was, and incidentally, create an industry that will be self-sufficient. The mark that I like to think of, the mark of how well we did, is that about before any other industry in Japan, the radio industry became the most heavily taxed one.
So the only one that was doing it.
It was the only one, and it was the industry that was producing tax revenue to help support the government. So I took that as a mark of success. But that was down the line, quite a bit. Just as I mentioned before, that we had to start from scratch, trying to set up the radio industry. Literally was starting from scratch, because the factories had been demolished. Whatever production facilities there were when the bombing started, the tools and the equipment, punch presses, things of that sort, had been distributed out into the countryside, away from such industrial sites as is Tokyo, Yokohama area, Kobe, Osaka, Himeji, Nagoya. So what we had to do was to gather this equipment together, such as it was, gather people who had been employed or could now be employed, and start creating production centers. In this early time, another obstacle that we were dealing with was this unknown enemy. MacArthur had planned an invasion of the Japanese islands. The Imperial General Staff of Japan was perfectly aware of it and had created something like, as I recall, 57 divisions to resist the invasion. If MacArthur had led the invasion into Japan, the devastation would have been, on both sides, would have been astronomical. As it was, the bombings in Japan were very heavy. The casualties, for example, in this, again, just in this Tokyo, the Yokohama area, was about 200,000 from, and most of that was from firebombs.
Yes, yes.
And this is not even considering the nuclear, the atom bomb, the devastation from the so-called conventional bombing was horrible enough. So that when this started, and this is now early in 1946, we were still expecting raids from the hills, because the men who were in this defensive force had been scattered into the hinterlands, and so the tension was very high among the Americans. This was another reason for this suspicion and inbuilt hostility toward the Japanese, because everybody went around armed, everybody expected to have attacks, and the Americans didn't trust the Japanese, and of course the Japanese were fearful of the Americans, and so getting started was slow. We had to overcome this feeling that I had found in myself of hostility. And, but we had to make a start. So my job, as I say, was to go back and into such records as we could find and set up production sites in Tokyo, well, basically in Tokyo and in Osaka, the two main places. We picked out some companies that had previously existed. We started up some new companies that existed for the first time. One of the companies that we rejuvenated that had existed for some time in Osaka was Matsushita. Matsushita Denki. It's known here in the United States by the trade name Panasonic, known elsewhere as Technique or National, Matsushita Denki. The company whose founder is a true Horatio Alger story. He became a very well-respected industrialist, starting out from a very mundane and inconspicuous background. One of the companies in Tokyo that we started from scratch is a company that today has gained a fair amount of international repute. It's known today as Sony. It had not existed before under that name, certainly. And Another company we started in the Osaka Kobe area was called Kawadenki. It's now known as Sharp. Had started from scratch. Other companies that we dealt with were old line companies, Tokyo Shibawara, which today is known as Toshiba, NEC, Nippon Denki, Nippon Electric Company. And these are, we gathered together then people from these.
When you say you're gathering together, how could you start? I mean, if I were there and it's all devastated, so to start a company, I wouldn't know where would you go. Did you have records?
We had some records, but not very many. Another difficulty, of course, your question is very apt, because to whom do you go to start with? The obvious ones, the obvious answer is you go back to the people who were in power before.
I understood McCarthy put those people in jail.
I was about to say.
I see.
One of the first orders that came out of SCAP was the dissolution of the Zaibatsu. Zaibatsu is a Japanese name that comes close to the English word for cartel. There were two dominant forces in Japan. Well, let me go back a little bit further. Japan has a national history that goes back some 26 centuries. The government of Japan today, Hirohito, Emperor Hirohito, is directly descended from the goddess Amaterasu, sun goddess. The Japanese believe that the emperor today is directly descended from divine authority. Nevertheless, until about 100 years ago, Japan was a confederation of feudal states. The feudal states, in each case, were controlled by warlords, and civil war between these warlords for all of these centuries. So, old history in Japan. Finally, about 100 years ago, in the Meiji Restoration, the country was brought together under a central government. And the suzerainty of the emperor was better established. But I say better, not firmly established, because the warlords, in effect, continued, but now they were centralized into the military command.
One big mafia.
Well, it was one big military autocracy. The Imperial General Staff, Tojo, for example, during the period leading up to the war, was essentially the governing authority. And that was one side of the effective government of Japan. The other side that I liken to these barons of the olden time. This was a Zaibatsu. This was a cartel. The Sumitomo, the Mitsuis, the Mitsubishis. These were the barons, economic barons, along with the military warlords who controlled the country for 100 years up to the Second World War. The first order that went out from MacArthur was that the Zaibatsu was to be eliminated. We come along, we go into these areas where these companies operated. When we look around, not only do we see no facilities, but we find no managers. what we had to do was to find lower level people, second level managers, and we literally, I literally put them into position and said, okay, as of today, you're going to start up this new company, and you're going to run it. And the poor people, and they were poor, and they were debts. These were people who were essentially clerks. Their role up to this time in management was essentially to provide a message conduit between the executives on one side and the workers on the other. The concept of intermediate management did not exist. The concept of delegation of responsibility, the implementation of assigned authority did not exist. So in effect, when we pick up this poor person and say, okay, we're going to have you start this company, or we're going to have you manage this company, we're going to have you put this company into operation, the individual in effect, not actually, but in effect said, who, me? But we had nobody else to work with. The CCS, this industrial division of which I was a chief, we never had, I think when I first went there, we possibly had we possibly had 6 people. 6 people. We never had very many more than that, I think. And toward the end, we had only 3. So we had to work through the Japanese. The thing that helped was that when we started, and this is literally the truth, we could not use nice democratic American principles of management when we started out. There is no doubt that many thought that MacArthur was a dictator there at the time. There is no doubt that I was dictatorial in my dealings with the Japanese at that time. We did not have time. And our language capability was pretty minimal. We could not take the time to explain, or did not have the facilities to explain the rationale and the logic and so on. And so we operated pretty much by fiat. You do it because I said you do it. And it worked. The Japanese, for the most part, were used
to that kind of treatment.
This kind of treatment. And as a matter of fact, at that time, they probably respected us more and were more congenial because we took that attitude.
Mm-hmm.
They were, as I mentioned, the middle managers, such as they were not managers in our sense of the word. They were taught to be submissive. They were taught to be compliant. They were taught to follow orders, and they did. They frequently came to me and said, well, how can I do this? And I would tell them, well, for example, how can I get vacuum tubes? And I would tell them, now we will go make vacuum tubes, and we'll do it my way. And they would say, you'll tell me what to do? I said, I'll tell you what to do. You do it, I'll tell you what to do. But this is really how we started. We picked out land areas full of rubble and we got work crews together. And your first job is to clear this land from the rubble, and you start putting up building a shack. I have some pictures that I'll show you. And you'll put benches, build benches, and you'll get machinery from out in the countryside that you sent out there, or somebody that you know of sent there, and you'll get them. Yeah. Where we could get materials locally, we did, but we imported from the United States or through the United States. At that time, we got materials from them, for them. My job at that time was selecting cadres of people to start these companies, to pick out sites, to build these shacks, to gather production materials, and much of it were hand tools, pliers and screwdrivers and things. I mean, the idea of a printing press, a metal press or a drill press. If we could find a drill press that dug an egg-shaped hole in a piece of metal, hey, that was pretty good. But I must say that the Japanese did fall to and did the job. They had nothing else to do. They were down in the depths of despair. The streets were clogged with debris. They had very little to eat. There was no currency, and at least they could see that now the Americans were beginning to help them. We got road crews together. We picked up people literally off the street, women too, women carrying babies on their backs. And we would put them to work cleaning up the streets. They would gather building blocks from the streets, and they would clean them off and stack them on the curb. And they would be used later to build buildings. We started to get, the only transportation there was, at that time, were bicycles for ox carts. Later on, we were able to get some propane-driven or gas-driven automobiles that you could use for public transportation. So if you get people starting to move around so that they could come to work. Very slowly, in the cities, the farm areas were not so badly off. Farmers began to plant. The Americans provided food. Some of it was American food. For example, one of the stories was that the Americans imported wheat to Japan. Japanese never ate wheat, or very seldom. They didn't know what to do with wheat. Here were bags and bags and bags of wheat, not rice, but wheat. We had to import domestic science people from the United States to train the Japanese on how to use wheat for food. But crops were beginning to be planted, and rice was imported from Asia, and people started to eat. The attitude of the people improved. They were somewhat more optimistic. They could begin to see that now they had been down at the lowest level. They're coming up. It was difficult, though, to get materials. One of the copper wire, for example. Very difficult to get copper wire. At the time, we couldn't get copper from the United States. I called a meeting of people together. And I said, we're going to not be able to meet our production schedule. We haven't got copper wire. And people were very concerned. And about a month or so later, I had a call from somebody in the 8th Army. The 8th Army was the military occupation force, separate from SCAP. He said, do you know about the submarine cable in such a location? I said, no, there's a submarine cable at that location. I said, no, there isn't. I said, what do you mean? I said, this was a 20-mile cable. It's gone. I said, how can it be gone? Well, it's not there anymore. The Japanese were very enterprising. They pulled up this cable, and we had enough copper wire to last us for quite some time. So they were enterprising. But the object at this time was to produce vacuum tubes. This was long before transistors, resistors, inductors, capacitors.
All the things that go into a radio.
All the things that go into a radio, and then to get an assembly. My project at that time was to bear down very heavily, very heavily, very heavily, in a dictatorial sense. We've got to get the parts together, we've got to get people trained at least at a minimal level, and we've got to get these assemblies going. And finally we started to get some going. Production had, now this was about the latter part of 1947, the first part of 48.
So you've been there almost a year for that.
Or a year and a half or so, yeah.
About 18 months.
Yeah. And so now I could begin talking to these managers about improving the yield, because the wastage was awful. We were getting units out, but the yield was intolerable. And I did not even talk to them about quality. Quality was impossible to talk about. These factories were still basically sheds. The floor was just hard-packed clay. Dust and dirt was everywhere. Now I talk to the managers and say, you know, you just cannot build, here you're trying to make vacuum tubes in the midst of this cloud of dust. You cannot. You have to have clean hands. And they did not understand the meaning of clean workspace. Finally, one day, I'll tell you another story. One day, I came back to the plant to see how they were doing. The manager greeted me, said, "Oh, now I understand about quality and cleanliness. Let me show you." And so I walked out into the production floor with the man and said, "See, this person, he is our man in charge of keeping the place clean." This was an elderly man. He had a device in his hands as he walked around the factory floor. On the end of a long stick were two cloth streamers. And he would go around from bench to bench, and he would flick his fly swatter kind of thing. And that would be cleaning off the benches. what he was doing was stirring up a greater cloud of dust. So I gathered these people together one day, and I said, now we have production going. Now we have to think of some way that we can improve the number of good units that we get out at the end of the production line. I want you to tell me one reason, and this was about 10 people or 15 people sitting around the conference table. I want you to tell me one reason why we are not getting more yield, or tell me one reason, or one thing that we could do to get more yield. And I explained to them what yield was. At this time, I had to again talk through my interpreter. Well, they put their heads together. And a conversation went on at the end of the table. For the longest time, I was waiting for an answer. And I turned to my interpreter and said, what are they talking about? Here, I asked a simple question. I want to get a simple answer. What are they talking about? He had been listening to them. And he said, oh, they're trying to decide on some kind of an answer that would be pleasing for you to hear. So, I don't want to be pleased. I want to get an answer. That they didn't understand. Well, you asked about my language capability. It was that incident, actually, more than anything else, that induced me to go learn the language myself, learn their customs, learn their mentality, learn their culture, so that I would not have to go through this very cooperative GI. But he didn't understand their language either.
Yeah.
So
he was an American.
He was an American. He just happened to have had Japanese parents. But so that decided me that I was going to learn enough Japanese to be able to talk directly, deal with them, and they were to deal directly with me. And it worked out. It worked out. I can tell you a couple of stories about MacArthur's character, if you like.
Yes. In your opinion, did he undergo some transformation himself, or did he remain pretty much as he was when he came ashore?
Oh, no. MacArthur was MacArthur. He stayed very much the same. MacArthur was absolutely the right man for the time and for the place. Absolutely. You can call him dictatorial, you can call him, well,
you said imperious.
You can call him imperious. As a matter of fact, that very characteristic was one reason why the occupation was successful, why MacArthur was successful, and why the Japanese cooperated. As a general, MacArthur was absolutely brilliant and courageous. As a person, he was truly of a great intellect. As a human being, he was utterly vain. I'll give you a story. It may be apocryphal, it may be true. The armistice signing was set up on the deck of the Missouri, September 2nd. And it was arranged in such a fashion that there would never be any doubt, as there was after the First World War, as there was maybe in Europe after the Second World War. It was set up so that there would never be any doubt that the Japanese surrender was full and final. It was also set up in such a way that there would never be any doubt as to who the man in charge was. It was MacArthur. There was no doubt about it. So the Japanese signed the surrender document, and the next day, both Chester Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, and MacArthur felt that, hey, this had been a long war. They were entitled to a little bit of rest and relaxation. They decided they would go fishing out in Tokyo Bay, where the USS Missouri was anchored. They were out there fishing, and all of a sudden a gust of wind came and it blew their boat over. And here, the two great military heroes were in the water, hanging on to the sides of their boat. Nimitz called across to MacArthur and said, hey, Doug, I want to ask a favor of you. MacArthur said, sure, what is it? Said, I want you to keep this predicament that we're in here a secret. And after all, how would it look if it got around that an admiral of the Navy couldn't even sail a rowboat? MacArthur agreed, but said, I want you to keep the same secret for me. Nimitz said, hey, Doug, you're an Army man. You're not supposed to know anything about boats. MacArthur said, yes, I know, but if it got around that I really can't walk on water, so many people would be disappointed. A famous incident also bears out the character. I think it was at Tarawa. The Marines had stormed ashore, the Army had followed, the island was secured, and now MacArthur thought it was proper for him to go ashore. And he always had bodyguards around him. They made a chair seat with their hands to carry him from the landing ship across the water, dump him on the sand of the shore. And they were carrying him across the water this way so he wouldn't get his feet wet. And he noticed that just as they were coming to the shore, there were some combat photographers there. He said, wait, don't take any pictures, wait. And he got down, got into the water, and came sloshing ashore, and they took his pictures. Now take the pictures, and that's a famous picture you see from MacArthur sloshing through the surf coming ashore. These may be apocryphal stories.
Well, if I can interject, I think that he understood the role he had to play and the image he had to project, and I would have a difficult time deciding how much of that was vanity and how much of that was a realization, because he was a brilliant man, of how he must appear in public.
Well, but he was also in tune. He was also in tune. I'll tell you two more stories. One was had to do with speed limits in Tokyo. The Americans, of course, were driving jeeps and staff cars and so on, and there were a lot of unfortunate pedestrian accidents. And MacArthur ordered the military police to set up a speed limit and to keep traffic under control. One day, the Russian general who was accredited to SCAF, Yushchenko, I think, as I remember his name was given a speed ticket by one of the MPs. And this Russian general just blew his stack. This was an insult, and he would not receive this kind of insult, and it came to MacArthur. And as a matter of fact, the general, lieutenant general he was, made a personal complaint. MacArthur said, were you speeding? Yes, I was speeding. So what? Then the ticket stays. And MacArthur turned around and walked out of the room. The Russian general looked after him and said, ah, what a man. The other story I would tell you is we were talking about, beginning to talk about quality. And about that time,
starting to.
No one is taught.
Those who write are writing from 1950 to the present time.
Yes.
And I've been too busy doing other things to have any personal
No reason.
gripe or, I mean, that has never bothered me. But
You should be set straight.
But there was at least a 5-year period before the present writers take over that ought to be given. Anyway,
Right.
we were talking about
quality.
Second
just
story
to
about
follow, yes, exactly. Just to follow on with one other story about MacArthur. We had talked before. I mentioned having this group meeting in my office and finally seeing that we had not really been getting across as well as I had hoped or thought that we were getting, and that led to my learning Japanese and Japanese culture and mentality and so on. One of the ways stemming from that time also, and jumping around, but two things came also beyond that from this meeting. One was the setting up of what later became known as the Electrical Testing Laboratory, and also the CCS seminars, Civil Communications Management Training class, which has since been called the seminars. The idea of teaching the Japanese how to manage more than we were doing in some formalistic kind of way was met by a fair amount of criticism and objection from other SCAP groups. I mentioned the Economic and Social section, ESS. They were not, if they were not antagonistic, at least they were certainly not supportive. Some people in CCS itself were antagonistic to the idea. I felt, and at this time, Protzman, Charles Protzman, who came over from Western Electric, now was on board, and we made a division of labor here. He was responsible for the wired communications section of the industry, telephones, telegraph, central switching equipment, wired communications. I was in charge of the electrospace, electronics, radio transmitters, domestic, commercial, international broadcast, international communications by radio. And so we had a neat division, but we were together in that we were concerned about the communications industry as a whole. And he and I together agreed that we've got to do more than we had been doing. We dreamed up this idea of having this management training class.
Had he been a manager of something?
I don't recall his background. He had been with Western Electric, I think, all of his career. He came out of Charlotte, which was a telephone manufacturing center, as I recall. And I think he had some managerial position in production, manufacturing management. The background there is that the Nippon Denki, Nippon Electric Company, at one time either, and I'm not sure of my facts here, either had been a subsidiary of Western Electric or there was some financial tie.
I understand that there was you might say like a sister industry, and in particular, this was a place where the Bell system could sell equipment, and they encouraged a relationship. They did this around the world.
Yeah.
To any country that was developing its communications, they would offer technical help and other things so the equipment better.
So I think there had been some relationship or some background that sponsored Protzman relative to the wired communication. He was not the first or the only. There were some delightful people who preceded him. McGill was one, Burke, a fellow by the name of Burke was another, and these were on the wired side. At that time, it was still early enough in the history of radio so that you might say I was an outsider as far as Western Electric was concerned. I mean, you couldn't...
Western Electric was entirely wires.
Yeah. RCA had been approached, but they were not interested in paralleling. Western Electric, GE was not, and so they had reached out for this strange person who came from a somewhat technical background rather than from an engineering physics background rather than a manufacturing background. But to get back to the point, when we found that he and I, Protzman and myself, were on one side of the argument relative to others who were not supporting the idea of these seminars, I went to MacArthur and made a presentation to him. And the objection that was raised was that, yes, it may help the Japanese, but then it may help them too much. And do we really want to do that? MacArthur heard both sides of the argument. He got up, turned to me and said, "Go do it," and he walked out. He was...
That was an extraordinary decision.
But it also, I think, indicates not only his mental nimbleness, his perception, his sense of mission, and his decision-making capability.
If you thought about it for a while, you'd see not to do this was to create a burden forever for the U.S.
Yeah.
And the other was we would launch the world into some kind of competition, which I'm sure at that time he thought we could easily handle.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I'm not aware, as far as I know, this was not done, what we did in CCS was not done in any other industry in Japan. It was not done in steel. It was not done in shipbuilding. It was not done in cloth manufacture. The Japanese progressed in these other industries, but it was through general economic assistance, I think, or consulting, so to speak, on the part of the Americans, ESS. But for us the Americans, literally to take an industry in hand and put them through an MBA program was unusual.
Okay, so this, he told you go do it.
And we did.
Now, I'm going to ask you questions if I may,
Sure.
because you go do it. I have only seen extracts of the notes you prepared.
Yes.
And what impresses me is the breadth of subject you covered and the spirit that you conveyed. Up till now, I haven't heard anything in your background that would make it seem likely that you would know the importance of those things. How did you get yourself educated to give that kind of a seminar with such a spread of topics, all packaged as you did?
It wasn't so difficult because now by this time we had been dealing with the industry and with the individual companies and with the individual people for 2 years or more. And we knew what our problems were. Our problems were, number one, the comprehension of management. I mean, to understand what it means to be a manager. Here we had literally created a management class. We had taken people from the second level or from intermediate management, and we had literally force-fit them into executive positions. They had followed direction, they were industrious, they were compliant, but we had no depth of management. So we knew that. They really did not understand. So to understand what it means to be a manager, this was an obvious thing.
Well, if I can break in, that is true, but there are many images of what it means to be a manager. And you seized on one.
Right.
Would you say that that was the common image amongst American managers as of 1946, 47?
I would say that, again, I suppose I was being dictatorial. It was my conception
I see.
of what it...
Well, particularly, and I have a quotation from you, which says, you put quality ahead of profit.
That's right.
Okay. Now, I have tracked down some people in history who said those same things before you. But that was certainly not the belief of many managers at that time. What was your belief?
It was my belief.
Where did you get it?
Well, first of all, I have read and have been reading extensively. I traced my reading back to the Industrial Revolution. I think we as American managers, had much to learn from the British, much to learn from the Industrial Revolution. And I was very much affected in my reading.
You mean as of that time you've been reading that sort of thing?
And before.
I see. So you just as a matter of scholarly pursuit and interest,
Yes.
your own interest.
Yes. And that was one thing. Another thing is that up to now, I have been, well, when I got out of college, I made a rule for myself. I would never stay in a job more than 2 years. And I held to that because, to me, this was in the midst of the Depression. And
It was not easy to jump.
but it wasn't also easy to go on at that time to graduate school.
Yeah.
I didn't have the money. And so my education was going from one company and one job to another. And I learned. And I made it a point to learn.
So you observed as well as learning on the job. You observed how you were managed and other people were managed. So out of that, you developed a manager out of your reading, your experience in these different jobs, and being mismanaged as well as managed. You decided how a manager ought to be.
Yeah.
And you put that into your notes and you said, Japanese, I'm going to teach you to do it my way.
Right. Well, I'll give you a quick story about part of my education. I was working for Crossley at the time. And oddly enough, at that time...
In Cincinnati?
In Cincinnati.
That's at the time when he was making the very, very high-powered transmitter, the cheap radios?
Yeah, I worked at WWL for a time. What was your high-powered transmitter and what?
Yeah, well, the idea was that you put a lot of power in the transmitter, the radio could be cheap.
That's right.
A lot of them.
You just told my story.
I see. Tell me more.
Well, I got the job one day. I didn't like it really, but I got the job to design and build a radio receiver, a domestic receiver. I was much more interested in transmitters. I liked high power. and to build a little radio receiver.
Any hand could do that.
Oh, and so I finished the project, and was very proud. I'd done it. And I called the vice president of engineering and vice president of marketing, and they all came around. They looked at it, and vice president of marketing said, "No, you've done a good job. Now take it back and redo it so we could sell it for $19.95." And I quit the company because I didn't think that was the way you design equipment. I was, at that age, I was young and independent, I guess. So,
well, I guess another thing is you did not have what I'll just say the commercial slant on the world. You had a much more idealistic view of what the engineer or scientist, technically trained person in our society was supposed to do, and the role of business in enabling that person to do it, as opposed to the current view, which is the job of the scientist, technician, engineer is to enable the businessman to do what he wants to do. You saw that, and so when you put this together, you were not reflecting the current American view of management. You were reflecting Sarasohn's view of what management ought to be.
I probably was. I don't think that I thought that, and I even looking back on it from this perspective, I don't think that I would be so crass or immodest to.
Well, let me try that a different way. You had met a variety of managers, and many good managers that you have worked with were like this, and you used them as your model, rather than thinking of yourself as in rebellion and doing something new. You were picking the best as you saw it, the best of American management, because I had met and worked with people like that too. So that would be a fairer, in your view.
I think so, because I think the motivation that both Protzman and I had was not to aggrandize ourselves, but rather that we had, maybe we had what I hope is an engineer's point of view.
Tell me about Protzman.
If I was idealistic, Protzman was more down to earth, I think. He was more practical and pragmatic. I think he had a good background in manufacturing. I think that possibly I was a rebel, an iconoclast. He was perhaps more of a company man, I suppose.
More establishment.
Yeah, more establishment oriented.
But he let you put the course together and teach it.
We both taught it, and we both were. As a matter of fact, what we did, to go back to the time when we got the go-ahead from MacArthur, we went down to Osaka. For some reason, I don't remember why Osaka particularly. Well, to get away from it, I guess. We each took a separate hotel room down in Osaka, and we holed up for a month. And we wrote.
From memory?
And from resources such as we had brought along. And we had some textbooks with us.
Still have any of them?
No, I don't think so.
Because I saw some notes extracted from your notes, which give some references to engineering management texts from the era. And I intend to track some of them down to see where you got your ideas, what they were saying compared to what you were saying. Anyway, you your own memory and reference books that you had along.
And also, we got some material through, I mentioned the Civil Information Education section. And they had what, how is it now called? The
That's not left over from ESMWT, Engineering Science and Management War Training. There's a lot of that.
They had some of that, but now the American embassies throughout the world now have these libraries
American Information Service.
Yeah. AIS.
Yeah.
Yes. This CINE section
Sorry, let me get to that.
they had the forerunner
I see.
of that. And so we got some material from them. And some were our ideas, some were our perceptions, and some were plagiarisms, no doubt.
Yeah. So you put this all together, you divided up into topics, you took
Yes.
some, you took some, and you made the
Yeah.
notes.
Protzman took things that had more to do with manufacturing, with finance, with accounting, and distribution. And so those were his subjects. My subjects were management, quality, research and development. Basically, innovation, going from, first of all, management direction, product innovation to manufacture. These were mine. And Protzman picked up at manufacture and carried it through to distribution.
But in that bit of it, you also put in quality.
Yes, but I put it in not as so much as a manufacturing technique, as a matter of fact,
But as a managerial technique.
but as a managerial technique. Because
Where did you get that idea? Because I don't know of anybody, well, I do know of some people before you, but they certainly wouldn't have been known to you, who were beginning to understand that quality in everything you do is the hallmark of good management. But that was certainly at your time a novel idea.
I was aware of the work that Stewart had done.
Did other people like yourself look at Stewart's work and immediately extrapolate it to the non-repetitive manufacture, sales, to...
At that time, no. The Japanese were aware of Taylor. The Japanese, I think, were aware of Gilbreth. Also, I was influenced by him.
Her?
Huh?
And her?
And her, oh yes.
She was a very good friend of ours. I have pictures of her with my children on her knee.
Great.
Great lady.
I later worked with a son of Fred Gilbreth.
So you were aware of them and their work and digested it, but then brought it out in your own flavor.
That's right.
So you understood what Taylor did, but you didn't subscribe to his philosophy of human relations.
No. I suppose, again, I suppose generally my motivation has been idealistically an engineer's motivation. I looked at management and the fruits of management as a creative process that must be improved and enhanced and aggrandized. And I suppose I was idealistic in that sense. Charlie Protzman's point of view was more pragmatic, and I'm not. No, as a matter of fact,
driver.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think probably we made a good pair, because I may have been idealistic, and he said, all right, now let's take this idealism and do something concrete with it. And so I think we worked out pretty well together. As we sat there in these two rooms separately, we didn't communicate. We may have seen each other for dinner or so on. And we came up with a script.
About 100 pages, was it? Couple hundred?
Yes.
Handwritten?
Handwritten, oh yes. Yeah.
Couple hundred pages handwritten.
And then we had it typed in our office, and we organized our first group
you have anybody else review it? Go over it?
No.
Just the two of you?
Well, at that time, by that time, my third person had come to join CCS. That was Polkinghorn, Frank Polkinghorn.
Who was he? What was his?
He basically a research man. He had come out of Bell Labs.
Bell Labs. Shoe arts operation?
No, out of he was a physicist by background, and I don't remember, but my inclination is that he was a communications specialist in the labs. He was an older gentleman. I was a youngster. Protzman was maybe 5 years older than I, 6 or 7 years older than I. And Polkinghorn probably was 10, 12 years older than I. Polkinghorn came from a very good technical background, but he was oriented more, he was more academically oriented. He spent more of his time at the universities, with the academicians, and in a research environment. But we formed a team of 3, and he joined us in this effort now. And yes, he did review our work.
So it was the 3 of you, but
right.
mostly you and Protzman.
And we called our first session in, I think it was toward the latter part of 1948, I'm not sure, at Waseda University.
Now you say you called a session, which we should order?
Yes.
Volunteers, you.
Exactly so. Exactly so.
You said you will be here.
That's right.
They showed up.
We said, you are the ones by name who are to attend. Only you and no substitute. You must attend every day for 4 days a week for 8 weeks. It was an 8-week session. You will be assigned homework, and you must report back the next day with your homework completed, and it will be reviewed and discussed with you. You must, at the end of this session, you must take these notes that were now being transcribed into Japanese. You must take these notes back to your place of work, and you must duplicate them, and you must now set up courses like this with your managers, and there will be a final exam. That final exam will be your next annual report. And if it does not show an improvement, you failed the course. If it shows an improvement, we'll give you a mark. But that's your final exam.
Let me just make, so if I was one of these Japanese managers, I would hear from you that I'm going to take this course, I'm going to be there 4 days a week, 8 hours a day,
oh, yes.
And I'm going to do the homework every night. I'm going to take this material, which you've done now in Japanese, I'm going to take it home, I'm going to teach my people, and the next annual report then will better show that I have put to work what you taught me.
Exactly so.
And if I didn't, it wasn't clear what was going to happen to me, but it could be very serious to my career.
Well, the most serious threat that you could give them at that time was you would be dishonored.
Because that very serious.
Oh, absolutely serious. Harikiri would only be the next step.
I see.
Because now they understood 2 things. One is that they now held positions of responsibility.
For the rebirth of Japan.
That's right. And they were making a direct contribution to the honor of their family, and even more important, to the honor of their country. And if they failed in these 2 regards, they would literally have to
Now,
disappear.
yeah, there was another aspect of it, and that is you in general were taller than most of them, and you represented a nation that had totally devastated theirs, and therefore you were a voice of unquestioned authority.
Absolutely.
So whether it was true or not, you knew the gospel.
Oh, and they believed it.
And they believed that, yes.
Oh, sure.
And acted on that. So it would be a matter of, the other side of the coin, a matter of real pride to be able to take what you had taught and begin to understand what this masterful race that conquered them could do. So get into that ballgame.
Well, you mentioned before JUSC, and it was about this time that I had a run-in with them. Or maybe a little later, but this time anyway. They had discovered some folks in the Japan Union of Scientists and Engineers, JUSC. They had made an important discovery. There was something called statistical quality control. The Americans had won the war. The American products, war products, military products, were better than the Japanese. I mentioned how they sailed a ship using the radar they had, how they maintained battle communications with the radio communication systems they had. And ours, we had problems with enough. One of the things, I keep jumping around, forgive me, but the operating life of vacuum tubes, Japanese vacuum tubes, and these were not complicated, they're triodes. Yeah.
Just to be able to modulate something, simply.
The operating life was so poor, the stock, the inventory that they carried on shipboard of vacuum tubes for replacement purposes is incredible. Anyway, Japanese Union of Scientists and Engineers made this important discovery in their reading. There was something called statistical quality control. This is what we need, because the American products were better than the Japanese products. The Americans won the war. The reason the Americans won the war was because their products were better. The products were better because they had something that was called statistical quality control. If we glom on to that statistical quality control, we would have discovered the American secret. It would be ours, and we could then find our place in the sun again. That's what we should do. And this is one reason why I made such a big point of quality control in the sense of total quality control in this seminar, this management course that we made, because I did not want them to get the idea that there was a magic wand that you could wave and suddenly you were perfect. I wanted them to understand that quality control was not a phenomenon of manufacturing, but rather it was a dedication of management. And so we had a big argument.
When you say you had an argument, why did you even care what the JUSC did?
I didn't want them to become diverted in their efforts, but more particularly, I did not want them to influence the management people that we were working with.
So, if I can capture that, you were a very important thrust in the communications industry, you and Prosper. And now here's the JUSC, and you wanted to be sure, if possible, to use them in your direction,
yes.
But if necessary, shut them off if they were going to do something that you saw as counterproductive.
That's right.
And so, did you have any hand in starting them up or helping them get started? They were just all on their own?
Oh, no.
Like a mushroom, just grew.
Well, basically it was an academic group.
I see.
And the universities were back in business. And the engineering faculties were forward-looking, they were progressive, and they're inquisitive. They got a hold of, they were able to subscribe to American documentation now, and so they began to read what was happening in America and in Britain and in France and in Germany. Germany had long been, technically, had been a strong influence in the academic community in Japan. Now they were able to begin to reach out into the world. And SCAP, MacArthur's headquarters, was supporting them and encouraging them because the Japanese for centuries had been so interned. And from the period how was it called? The Great Economic Sphere.
The Greater East Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Co-Prosperity Sphere. Had so interned the Japanese nation that they did not literally know what was going on. The progress that America had made in radar, for example, the progress that America had made in vacuum tube design and manufacture, they had no idea about. One of the first pieces of equipment that I had seen in Japan when I first went there was a General Electric tube making machine. I knew that the Japanese could not have imported that machine. How did they get it? It was brand spanking new. In fact, it was draped in a cover when I saw it. It had never been used, but it had a General Electric nameplate on it. What had happened was that just before the war, there was a Japanese delegation that made a tour of the United States, and the Japanese had taken photographs of this machine. They had made drawings of it, and they had duplicated this machine, even to the nameplate. But it had stood there. It had never been used. They were not aware of what the machine could do. And they were so, but now they began to reach out, and SCAP encouraged them. And this is how JUSC had become aware now of statistical quality control. But I thought at that time it was a diversion. It ran the risk of being misunderstood. It was not a magic wand. What I wanted was to instill fundamental concepts of management in this cadre of new managers. In fact, we called our textbook The Fundamentals of Industrial Management. And that was specifically the title we gave the textbook we used in our CCS seminars. Later on, I wrote a book in Japanese, I have a copy of it here, you see, called The Industrial Applications of Statistical Quality Control, because it was time then, I felt.
What you say you had a run-in with the JUSC. What form did that take?
Well, people like Koyanagi and some of the others who were leaders in this, in effect, I shut them off.
What do you mean?
But I told them that at a later time, what we will do is we will get experts in the field to come over here, and we will then, in the same way we are having the CCS seminar, we will have seminars and training classes in quality control that will build on the foundation that we've laid here. And so...
well, now you say you had a run-in. That would make me think that you said all that, but they didn't like it. And
well, they didn't like it.
They didn't like it at all.
Yeah. They felt that I was depriving them or something. And indeed I was, and I meant to. But at a later time, I wrote to Short to invite him to come. But I don't remember now. I think he was ill, and he wasn't available, or he did not make himself available. I went to this other SCAP section, ESS, and I sold them on the idea that here we were working with just the communications industry. It was a small part of the national economy. Wouldn't it be, and here we were already doing it. In fact, they were aware of our management classes. In fact, they started to send people to our class. So I put it to them, one of the people, I forget his name, Fowler, I think, that you could do more for Japan in general. Don't make it just a communications industry. Let's open it up to all of the industry, and let's go searching for people who might be instrumental in promoting this idea now that we're further along. And one of the names was Deming. If I'm not mistaken, he was a professor at Columbia University.
Columbia, and also involved with the Census Service of Commerce.
I think he was at Columbia when I...
At that time, yes.
And he was invited over, I think about 1950, if I'm not mistaken.
Who invited him? The Japanese?
No, ESS.
ESS invited him over.
Yeah.
And, but you weren't part of that, so you don't know the details.
No. And, I think Koyanagi claims that he invited him over. It doesn't really matter.
Well, Deming has spoken of the fact that he came over first under MacArthur's aegis, where he did some survey work because he had this experience in census. And as a result of that, one, he recognized the Japanese situation and saw many potentialities there. And that later he was invited by the Japanese themselves to come back and talk about quality. And I don't know the details of what they asked, but when he agreed to come, and we did come, at his suggestion, they invited the top people of the industry, and they all came. They immediately came, and that was the beginning as he saw it.
Well, that was what he saw. I think what we were doing preceded that. I don't recall, I didn't have personal experience, but I could believe that he may have been there earlier on for a census requirement, because there had been no census for years up to that time, and the population had gone down. I think at that time the population was something like 50 million. But we did not know what the structure of the population was.
Well, he was internationally famous for the work he had done in census. He was a real expert in the whole issue of what you do when you take census data and analyze and make sense of it. So that's a natural thing for him to be called on.
I can remember that there was a concern. I remember that we had a certain discussion early on, people in general headquarters, SCAF organization, about birth control, about what our position should be vis-a-vis birth control, because the population, relative to the economy, relative to the availability of food, and what was going to be the future of this country, and shall SCAP take a definitive position, a government position on abortion and birth control. But nobody knew what the structure of the population was. So what you're saying kind of rings a bell in my mind. But no, when I went to ESS at that time, my feeling was that I thought we were making progress with the communications industry, and I had my hands full. Here was an opportunity, or maybe a need, to
expand,
to promulgate the faith through all of Japanese industry. And why don't you fellows in ESS, who have responsibility for the rest of Japanese industry?
Is it fair to say that at that time you also felt that you laid out, if we will, the Bible for general management, and it was time to bring in specialists on other things, and if your Bible could be used for a wider audience, then these other people would have a framework with which to work?
I think that is a fair statement.
So you didn't look upon Deming or Duran or anybody else as coming over and teaching general management. You
No.
wanted to come and add their specialized things. I understand that, I can't remember this man's name, the name Sullivan comes to mind, but somebody went over there to teach, for example, value engineering.
I don't recall.
But you weren't, that was probably after you.
Yeah.
All right. So, there you have now, you taught this course. How did they react to this course? I mean, these guys are summoned. Did you see lights go on? Did they accept this reluctantly?
Not reluctantly, no. They were, as a matter of fact, I got no negatives. They, again, were compliant. They were given orders, and they saluted and said, "Yes, sir. You ordered it, we'll obey." They incessantly, this is one thing that bothered me about the course. We repeated it also in Osaka at a later time, and it was the same. They took copious notes. They insistently took notes. They wrote continuously. I had taught in school at a certain time when I was in Cincinnati. I was an adjunct instructor in physics and mathematics. I had taught while I was in New York. So I was not unfamiliar with teaching at the academic level. But my concept of teaching was I was in communication with a student, and it was a two-way thing. I think what bothered me about it was they were receptors. They were receivers.
You couldn't get them to participate.
They would not participate. They would copy down what you said. And we spoke to them both in Japanese and in English. And we did have interpreters where there was a need. And most of these people, I wouldn't say most, but many of the people could understand at least some English. And we could get to them. But they would copy it. But to get them to look at you, to get them to discuss or discourse on a thing. For example, I deliberately raised an issue with them. Well, two things. I did very nasty things to them. As I said, I made a point to learn Japanese customs, but I didn't convey them. We talked earlier, again, I'm jumping around. We talked earlier about Sony Corporation. Sony Corporation at that time was called, it was known as Tokyo Communications Company. It was a tiny little company. I felt they weren't taking me seriously. Their management, a man who now received all kinds of honors, not only in Japan, but also in the United States and around the world. I felt that I really wasn't getting across to him. Well, one day I did something in Japanese that was absolutely unforgivable. It was an insult. While we were talking, I unceremoniously got up, turned around, and walked out of the room. I went back to my office. A little while later, he came rushing into my office. My God, what did I do? How have I insulted you? What? I said, oh, now I have your attention. Now this is what I want you to do. These are little techniques that...
You really had to crash through a culture barrier.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And later on, you talked with Hopper, Kenneth Hopper.
Yes.
And I think he quoted to you a statement that he made about how Sarasohn got to him. He remembers to this day this, but it was a way of really getting these people to understand that I was serious. When I told them, for example, as I mentioned earlier, that there will be a final exam, and it will be on how well your company does. I don't care what you do. Could care less. But what impact will you have upon your company now as a result of my spending this time with you? That got across to me.
Now, I should think, I don't really know the Japanese character, but I have found so many Japanese to be very sentimental.
Or they are.
And for you to have put the matter that way would have reached to their soul, as I would say. It really seems to me it was an extraordinarily insightful way for you to deal with them. But at the same time, I have to marvel at what you were doing, because it seems to me, again, what you're doing is getting them to stop having a certain self-image about what it means to be a manager, and to adopt an entirely new one, which is not only new to them, but out of step with the culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, would you talk a little bit about the problems that people had in that adaptation? Because the reason I'm asking is that I am trying to do something like that with many American managers who I see are need to do things that represent an entirely new self-image and out of step with the managerial culture as they understand it. So I'm interested in your experience as an agent of change of this sort.
Well, let me tell you what further that we did. I mentioned this management training class. I did another thing that was out of step with what they were, what their culture indicated, or what their past experience indicated. I mentioned earlier on that we set up an electrical testing lab. What this was, essentially, was a kind of an underwriter's laboratory.
You get seal approval.
Now we were starting to get components, we were starting to get radio receivers, we were starting to get telephone instruments that worked, we were starting to get central office switching equipment that could really operate. We had relays that would not only flop, but they would relax. I wanted to be sure that they understood that they had obligations. They had to meet quality standards. And now we're beginning to teach them quality control in the full sense of the word. So I set up a device under the government called the Electrical ETL, Electrical Testing Laboratory. And I had a wonderful Japanese professor by the name of Dr. Abe, with whom I had a very close personal relationship. He understood me. I could trust him. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was almost not a Japanese in the traditional sense of the word. He had been schooled in the United States, and so he was a great guy. And I made him the director of this laboratory. Maybe I was doing a Zaibatsu myself, stacking the deck with my own people. Anyway, an edict went out that all communications equipment that would be offered for sale must be prototype tested in ETL, Electrical Testing Laboratory. That if it could not pass the test, it would not be approved for manufacture. That if it did pass, there would be unscheduled testing of products that were taken at random off dealer shelves. That all future manufacture must meet the quality standards of the approved prototype. I called in engineers from various companies, and we sat down for weeks, and we finally agreed on...
So you started essentially the voluntary standards operation.
That's right. Which has been carried out to this day. We agreed upon quality standards, we agreed upon test technique, we agreed upon test instrumentation, and Dr. Abe took it under his wing, and we put it into effect. And this was unheard of. You mean that I'm not free to manufacture as I please? Yes, you are. Once you pass it, prototype test. And now that's been taken over by the government, and it's still going on. Because I put to them that before the war, if a product came to the United States, Kewpie dolls, you remember the celluloid Kewpie dolls? Typical. They would last for a little while, and then the arms would fall off. Or any product that was stamped, made in Japan, was a guarantee of shoddy manufacture. We would not live through that. As a matter of fact, you probably know, but there's a story, which I think is true. At that time before the war, when a product was stamped made in Japan, it was considered to be shoddy manufacture. So the Japanese government renamed an island.
USA.
USA.
I remember you could buy things made in USA, it would say.
It was made in USA.
Japan, yeah.
It would stand made in USA, made in USA. But I'm jumping ahead. One of the things about the Japanese government today, I think there is a cabal between MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Finance. They are really controlling...
They're still like the Zaibatsu.
They are, in a sense, Zaibatsu. In one way, they're working for the welfare of the Japanese nation and the economy. And from a nationalistic point of view, fine. From a Zaibatsu, can I say a Zaibatsuitic, or from a cartel point of view, from the international trade point of view, we have our problems with it. But I must say to the credit of MITI. Considering that made in Japan prior was a guarantee of shoddy manufacture, it is to MITI's credit today that they are dedicated to the proposition that a product stamped made in Japan today will not be a national embarrassment. And this is a lesson that the American manufacturers have to learn.
Am I to conclude from what you've just said that you instituted this notion of the independent test and the voluntary standards development and so forth, but that MITI then made it sort of one of their central thrusts to keep it going?
Absolutely.
I see.
Absolutely. And we were glad to see it.
Yeah. But as you understand it, all of that was a new idea.
Yes.
Absolutely.
It had not existed before.
Now, in the United States, Herbert Hoover had started the voluntary standards operation. I served in the Commerce Department, and I went back and read many of his speeches. And on the night before I was born, he made a speech on the role of the voluntary standards in the United States in the furtherance of commercial enterprise, standards of nuts and bolts and 2x4s, and as one to make things fit together, and also as an agreed basis for commerce, so that you could know what you were getting.
He depended upon his engineering background.
That's right, and also that it was a voluntary thing. It is not.